Okay, so a few months ago I said this. I really can't wait to do the MPs. I think it'll expose bigger differences between the rackets, and I always like talking about head frames, so we'll do that one soon. This isn't exactly soon after that, but we did get some new rackets now, so it's finally time to give head MP rackets a little overview. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets and Runners. So I really like these brand overview videos because they're a great way of showing how certain design differences can actually make for big playability changes on court. There's really no brand that encompasses that better than Head because they have so many rackets that there's bound to be some similarities between them all, but that also means that the differences will be more technical, and we love technical. Now I do just want to say before we go on that the channel has been growing so much recently. We really are thankful to each and every one of you. Let's keep that going. Please remember to subscribe. It really means a lot to us. Also, remember that any of the rackets we talk about on this channel, you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Please do leave a like on the video, follow me and the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comments section what you want me to cover next. So Heads MP rackets, like I said, there are a lot, so this video could get very long, but I am going to try to keep it as organized as possible. So I'm actually going to do the same thing I did in the pros video, just in reverse order. I'm going to order these rackets in terms of least powerful to most powerful. We all know about Head CPI ratings. On the pro video, let's just say I disagreed with it a little bit. I'm much happier with what they came up with for the MPs. So the order is going to follow that pretty closely. Also, instead of talking about one individual racket then moving on to the next, I'm going to focus on one racket, but also talk about how it compares to the one or two others that are closest in terms of playability. That way I can better explain how those differences stack up against each other. Enough chatting though, we have a lot of rackets to cover. We don't carry the Prestige MP, which would be the least powerful and most controlled. So let's get right into talking about the Radical MP. Also, if I sound a little stuffy, that's because I'm a bit under the weather today. So if I don't sound as energetic as usual, that's why I apologize. So the Radical MP is what I've gone with as the least powerful, although it was kind of tough to choose. And I also have to say there are kind of two separate groups of Head MP rackets. Three of these are more on the control side of things, and the other two are more geared towards power and spin. You've got the Speed, Gravity, and Radical in one corner, and then the Boom and the Extreme in the other. The Radical is the least powerful of the bunch though, because it has the lowest launch angle, and it's also the racket you have to swing the hardest in order to generate real power and depth. With the Speed and the Gravity, because they have those 100 square inch heads, you get a little bit more for free. With the Radical, you really do need to make good contact, which requires more advanced technique. That being said, when you compare it directly to the Gravity MP, which is the closest in terms of power and control, the Radical does have a bit more zing when you do make good contact and you're swinging really fast. That's because the Radical has an undulating beam design that's 20 millimeters in the top portion of the hoop, but then thickens up pretty drastically near the throat where it's 23 millimeters. That thicker portion makes it stay a bit more rigid during ball pocketing, and you feel that more and more the harder you hit, and that's what gives it a little bit more top end power. The Gravity has a constant beam and a pretty low flex, but it also has a low static and swing weight, so it can feel a little noodly and flimsy, and does tend to get pushed around either when you're trying to counter pace or generate your own. You can absolutely fix that flimsiness with customization, especially by adding some weight to the handle for stability, but the Radical will always have a bit more pop on big shots because of the differences between these beams. That's one of the major benefits of this beam design. It's why you see so many power rackets like the Pure Drive and E-Zone have them, but this beam design does also take away from a bit of control on the Radical. Every time I play with a non-constant beam control racket, I have a bit of a disconnect between me and the ball. Because the beam doesn't have a constant seamless flex to it, that adds a tiny bit of randomness as to how the ball leaves the string bed. The good thing is this is just something you need to get used to, and once you do, it won't feel random anymore, but it is still something that's worth noting, especially when you're comparing it to the best control rackets. Now in terms of spin, the Radical gives you exactly what you want without anything extra or over the top. It has one of those 16 by 19 string patterns that gets a little bit more dense in the sweet spot. That's why the launch angle is low, and that also means there isn't a ton of string movement here. I definitely don't mind that. It's still a 1619, so that's inherently spin friendly in and of itself. It's just not going to artificially amplify spin, but if you do want that in a racket with similar specs, go for the Extreme Tour. Overall though, the Radical is a fantastic control-oriented racket that's also extremely well-rounded. That's what happens when you throw a non-constant beam on a control racket. It may not be as good for control as a Blade or a Percept or a CX200, but it's got quite a bit more power and a lot of players will like that. Now, obviously, I'm a huge fan of the Gravity Pro. I've talked about it quite a few times on this channel, but this is not just a lighter Gravity Pro. Those extra 2 millimeters of beam thickness and the 16x20 string pattern makes for a pretty big difference in feel. This is definitely a less pure feeling racket. It's got a more hollow and sticky feel where the ball gets a little bit lost in the string bed during pocketing, but it's not nearly as bad as something like the Clash, for example. I would actually say it's a little bit less precise than the Radical because of that stickiness, but like I said, it's also easier to generate power and depth with. That's a give and take with 100 square inch head sizes. That head size is also what makes this racket more forgiving, but keep in mind with the Gravity MP, if you do want it to hold up well when you're swinging big, you are going to need to add some weight to it. That's not something you're going to have to worry about with the Speed MP. For one, it's already heavier with a higher swing weight, but it's also got a thicker beam and, more importantly, a modern beam design, so there's a much more crisp pop off the string bed here. Even if you were to customize the Gravity MP up to the Speed specs, the Speed still has a much more rewarding feel when you go for big shots. Even the head shape on the Speed is better for a more power-oriented shot. The teardrop shape on the Gravity is more so made for a slower pace shot where you really grab the ball and then place it with methodical control. That's just it with the Gravity. Other than the head size and of course the weight specs, everything about this racket is pretty traditional. It's more so made for players who want that methodical, guidey type of control from their racket, but also like the forgiving feel of a 100. It's actually very unique because there aren't that many rackets that are this forgiving but also this traditional in their control, so especially if you're willing to work with your racket to eventually find your ideal spec, it really is a special frame. Now the Speed may have a constant beam and pretty soft flex, but the thicker and overall just more powerful design of that beam does take away from the type of control you get with the Gravity. It's a sacrifice that you know you're making when you go for a Speed. It really is a jack of all trades in the truest sense, where it's not going to be elite in any one thing, but it's so good at everything that you kind of forget about that. Now, of course, if a racket is good at everything, it also has to be very good for spin, and it is actually very interesting to compare these two rackets because yes, the Speed is better for spin, but it's much closer than you might expect. I've always found any version of the Gravity much more spin friendly than they should be considering the specs. The Gravity Pro already impresses me for such a thin beam to 1820, but when you take away 2 main strings, you're opening up the string bed, you also thicken up the beam, of course the racket's going to be even more spin friendly. I definitely never feel limited in terms of the amount of spin I can generate with this racket. It's kind of like the Radical MP in that it doesn't really amplify spin, although I will say this racket has more spin than the Radical because of that 100 square inch head size. Now there is more spin tech going on with the Speed. The grommets themselves are a little bit more open and the beam is more aerodynamic, especially in the throat. This is the first racket we talk about today where you do feel a bit of spin amplification when you do use proper technique. So I will say it does complement the modern spin friendly style a little bit better than the Gravity, but it's very close between the two rackets. Also, this is a good time to mention the differences between the old Auxetic and Auxetic 2.0. Like I've said a few times now, the change is subtle, but Auxetic 2.0 does feel a bit more solid in general. You can really feel the tech inside the Speed helping it hold up a bit better on impact, whereas the Gravity has a more raw feel to it. I will say that makes for a slightly more muted response on the feel, although that could be this matte rubbery paint that's doing that, but I do think it does technically improve its playability. So that's it for the 3 more control-oriented head MP rackets. I'm sure you kind of figured it out by now, but here's a quick synopsis of who each racket is for. The Speed and the Radical are kind of similar but different in that they are very well-rounded jack-of-all-trades rackets, but the Radical does put more emphasis on precision and control, whereas the Speed is more user-friendly and spin-friendly. I think that's why the Speed has been more popular than the Radical recently. Most players nowadays, if they are looking for a well-rounded racket, would rather sacrifice a bit of control for more spin. The Gravity is kind of a weird one because while I do think it is a little bit less precise than the Radical, it is better for that slower type of control. This is really made for baseliners who appreciate the forgiving nature of a 100, but also want the best control they can get at that head size and at this weight. It is a very interesting racket. I think it has huge potential if you customize it. I'm still exploring with customization on this racket, but the best player at the store plays with a customized Gravity MP and absolutely loves it. Like I said, there are 2 categories within heads MP rackets, and the Boom and Extreme are much more modern power and spin oriented than the other 3. Now I do think the Extreme is more controlled than the Boom, which may surprise some of you considering the Boom has a constant beam, and of course because the Extreme is in no way, shape, or form a control racket. Neither of these 2 rackets are really any good for traditional control. If you do try to flatten it out, they have very launchy and inconsistent string beds, but I do find the Boom to be noticeably worse for that than the Extreme. To me, the MP doesn't really have much in common with the Boom Pro. You all know how I feel about that racket, but whatever magic there is going on over there isn't really applicable here. It feels like every bad characteristic on the Pro is kind of amplified here, especially that slightly wild side it can sometimes have. I actually personally don't think the Boom Pro has a wild side, but I can see why some people would think that. Am I just telling myself that to make myself feel better about my racket of choice? Maybe. But anyways, the string bed is so open up here in the sweet spot that it does have a tendency to spray the ball, and it's really hard to get a solid and stable response from this racket. It also doesn't have the same feel that the Pro has. I've personally never gotten myself dialed into the Boom MP, so maybe I am being a bit harsh, but it is just a tough racket to control. Now don't get me wrong, the Extreme does have a bit of that wild side. It's got an open string bed with very open spin grommets, which is/was common of spin rackets, but it still feels more solid than the Boom, even for flatter shots. The very important thing, though, that sets it even farther apart from the Boom and actually makes it a viable option for advanced players is, of course, the fantastic spin potential. This is probably the most spin-friendly 100 square inch racket right now, which means that you absolutely can control the ball as long as you're using spin. There are plenty of advanced players who require this amount of spin to control their shots, and if that's you, this is one of the best options right now, and you probably already know that you're going to be making a small sacrifice in control to get that. The Boom is fine for spin. Like I said, it does have a pretty open string bed, but it's still not nearly as spin-friendly as the Extreme. What that means is that there's unfortunately no specific hitting style for which this racket is going to be one of the most confidence-inducing frames you can buy, which is why these two rackets are just in different tiers in terms of their usability at the highest level. Still, the Boom MP does have one very redeeming quality, and that's just how ridiculously easy it is to generate power with this thing. It's still not the right racket if you're trying to generate power with a fast, full stroke, but if you do want a racket that helps you get the ball over the net, this is one of the best in that 295 to 300 gram category. The squared off top portion of the hoop effectively moves the sweet spot a little bit higher up the frame, which means you get a ton of leverage over the ball, so you don't need to use perfect technique to get good, easy depth. It's also important to say that despite its flaws, it's still more stable and consistent than much lighter rackets, so it's really made for those players who are playing against bigger hitters but need a bit of help from their racket to compete with that power they're facing. Is it a straight up power racket? No, I don't find it as versatile for different types of power shots as something like a pure drive, but it is still more comfortable than traditional power rackets. It is a little bit like the Clash in that regard, but honestly they are two pretty different rackets, so if you do want me to make a full-on comparison between the two, I can do that. But honestly, please say no, they're not my favorite type of rackets. I don't want to have to play with them more than I need to. That's really just unnecessary shade to the Clash and the Boom MP. I apologize. Now, before we finish up, I do just quickly want to touch on how the Speed and Extreme MP are different, because for the less keen tennis nerds of you, they may actually seem quite similar on paper. The Extreme is a true classic spin racket made for big spinners who grind from behind the baseline and really don't care about much variety beyond that. This type of racket will always be around somewhere, but we have seen the industry trending away from these artificially spin-friendly technologies. This racket does still have a lot of those, so if you are looking for ultimate spin, this is the racket for you. Despite what the Speed might look like, it's not nearly as much of an artificially spin-friendly racket that's willing to sacrifice a whole lot to be the best in spin. It has much better control, stability, and feel than the Extreme, and really it's just a much more well-rounded racket in general. So even though it is a 16 by 19 100, it's more comparable to rackets like the Radical and the Gravity. I am going to wrap it up because this video is going to be way too long, but I do just want to say I really like Head's lineup because having this many rackets means there are just small differences between each frame, and that allows you to perfectly tailor your racket exactly to what you need. Other brands will have their dedicated power, spin, and control lines, but by coloring between those lines, Head is basically saying you don't have to go all in for one. Maybe try something that has a lot of control, but then a bit of spin sprinkled in as well. I really like that concept. As far as which one is my personal favorite, I would probably say the Speed. Definitely not the Boom MP, but enough roasting that racket. It is going to be very good for the type of player it's made for. With all that said, that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. And remember that if you do want to demo any of these frames, you can come visit us in store, or you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.